"Don't go to the meeting," the girl said. She was 7 years old, standing in the doorway of his study in her pajamas, and her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. Theodore Ashby looked up from his desk. The clock on the wall read 11:43 at night. He had a presentation folder open in front of him and a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. Maisie. He said her name the way he always did when she appeared somewhere she shouldn't be, gently but with a question underneath. "You're supposed to be asleep." "I know." She didn't move from the doorway. Her socks were the ones with the little foxes on them. She was looking at him in a way he couldn't quite read. "But you shouldn't go. To the meeting tomorrow." He set down his pen. Theodore Ashby had spent 31 years building Ashby Capital from a two-person brokerage in a rented office on Wellington Street into one of the most respected private equity firms in Ontario. He had negotiated with people who lied to his face and smiled while they did it. He knew how to read a room, how to read a contract, how to read the space between what a person said and what they meant. He did not always know how to read his granddaughter. "Why not?" he asked. Maisie chewed her bottom lip. It was something she did when she was working something out. "I heard Uncle Bren talking on the phone, in the garden. He didn't know I was there." Theodore kept his face still. "What did he say?" he said. She paused, and he could see her trying to remember it exactly the way she'd heard it. "He said the old man doesn't need to know until after it's done." And then he laughed. The study was quiet outside. Rain had started against the windows. Theodore looked at his granddaughter for a long moment and then said, carefully, "When was this?" "This afternoon. When Grandma sent me out to pick the mint." He nodded, slowly. "Okay, sweetheart. Thank you for telling me. You're not going to go?" "I'm going to think about it," he said. "Go to bed. I'll come check on you in a minute." She looked at him for another second. She had her mother's eyes, dark and steady, and then she patted back down the hall. He listened to her door close. Theodore sat very still. The meeting was with his son-in-law, Brendan Colville, and two representatives from a Montreal investment group called Duvet Partners. It was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning at Ashby Capital's downtown offices. The stated purpose was to finalize a restructuring agreement that had been 18 months in the making, an arrangement that would fold 3 of Ashby Capital's subsidiary funds into a new joint entity, with Duvet holding a 30% stake. Theodore had spent weeks reviewing the proposal. His lawyers had reviewed it. Everything had been signed off. He had trusted Brendan with the process because Brendan was his son-in-law, because Brendan had been with the firm for 9 years, and because Theodore's daughter Simone had asked him to, back when she was still speaking to him about things other than the weather and the grandchildren. He picked up his phone. He put it down again. The thing about being 64 years old and having done what Theodore Ashby had done with his life was that you learned to take certain feelings seriously. Not hunches. He had no patience for hunches. But pattern recognition, the way a number sat wrong on a page. The way a handshake lasted a half-second too long. The way a man laughed on a phone call he thought was private. He opened his laptop. He started with the Duvet Partners Incorporation filing, which was publicly available. The company had been registered in Quebec 14 months ago. He had known this. What he had not looked at closely enough, apparently, was the list of directors. There were 3. The first 2 he recognized. Philippe Audet and a woman named Corinna Staub, both legitimate players in the Montreal financial corridor. The third name he had to read twice, Brendan A. Colville. Theodore leaned back in his chair. The rain was heavier now. He thought about the restructuring agreement, about the clause on pages 41 and 42 that shifted governance authority of the joint entity to a simple majority vote, about how, with a 30% stake and the proxy Brendan controlled through Simone's holdings, Simone had signed over to Brendan 3 years ago when they'd gone through the rough patch and she'd been trying to show trust. Duvet Partners would hold effective control. The old man doesn't need to know until after it's done. Theodore did not sleep that night. He made tea at 2 in the morning and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where the rain was flattening the hedges. He thought about his daughter, who was upstairs asleep, with a man who had spent 18 months engineering the transfer of her father's life's work to himself. He thought about Maisie, 7 years old in her fox print socks, who had been sent out to pick mint and had come back, knowing something the adults in her life had not wanted her to know. He thought about what to do. The wrong choice, the emotional choice, would be to call Brendan that night, to confront him, or to call the meeting off, or to do any of the things a man did when he was angry and felt betrayed and wanted the other person to know it. Theodore had seen that choice play out in other men's lives. It felt satisfying for about 48 hours, and then the lawyers got involved and everything became much more expensive and much less certain. The right choice was harder. He went back to his desk. He pulled up the shareholder agreement, the restructuring proposal, and the Duvet Incorporation filing side by side. He began to read. By 4:30 in the morning, he had found 3 things he should have found in the original review. A clause in Schedule C that allowed the joint entity to assume outstanding liabilities of the subsidiary funds, liabilities that, under certain conditions, could be attributed back to Ashby Capital itself. A valuation methodology for the fund assets that had been quietly revised in the final draft in a way that benefited Duvet's entry position by approximately 14%. And a side letter, referenced but not attached in the main agreement, that he had been told was administrative only. He had never seen the side letter. He called his lawyer, Pauline Mercier, at 7:15. She answered on the second ring. She had been his lawyer for 20 years, and she did not ask questions when he called before business hours. He told her what he had found. He told her about the side letter. He told her about Brendan's name on the Duvet filing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Don't go to the meeting," Pauline said. "I know, and Theodore, don't tell Brendan, yet. Don't tip it. He hadn't planned to. I need you to request the side letter through the formal disclosure channel, today, before 9. And I need you to find out who else has signed it." "I'll start now." He showered and dressed. At 8 o'clock, Maisie came down to breakfast in the same fox print socks. She wore them 2 days running when she liked them, and she looked at him across the kitchen with a question in her eyes. "I'm not going," he told her. She didn't say anything. She poured herself a bowl of cereal and sat down, and that was all. Simone came down 20 minutes later, in her work clothes, moving with the efficient speed she'd had since she was a teenager, phone already in hand. She kissed Maisie on the top of the head and looked at her father. "You're still here," she said. "I thought you had the Duvet meeting. It's been postponed." She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the careful adjustment of a person recalibrating. "Brendan will want to rebook it quickly. They've been waiting on this." "I expect he will," Theodore said. She poured her coffee. He watched her. He had spent most of her life watching her, trying to understand the distance that had grown between them, trying to find the thread of when it had started. She had her mother's quickness and her father's stubbornness, and at some point those 2 qualities had stopped being a combination that allowed them to talk easily to each other. He wanted very much to tell her. He didn't. Brendan appeared at 8:45, jacket on, keys in hand, looking at his phone. He was 41 lean, with the kind of easy assurance that Theodore had once mistaken for capability. He stopped when he saw Theodore. "I thought you were heading in. Change of plans," Theodore said. Brendan's expression did not change, which was its own kind of answer. A man who heard his father-in-law had canceled a crucial meeting and didn't register surprise was a man who had been prepared for complications. "Pauline's office called me this morning," he said. "Something about a disclosure request, standard process, Theodore." Brendan set down his keys. His voice had gone careful the way it did when he was managing a situation. "Is there something you want to talk about?" "There's nothing I want to discuss before my lawyers have reviewed the outstanding," Theodore said. He kept his voice pleasant. He had spent 31 years keeping his voice pleasant. "I'm sure you understand." Brendan looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up his keys and said he'd be in touch, and he left. The front door closed. Maisie, who had been quietly eating her cereal through all of this, looked up at her grandfather. "He was mad," she said. "He was worried," Theodore said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" He thought about it. "When you're mad at someone, you want them to know. When you're worried, you try not to let it show." She considered this seriously. Then she went back to her cereal. The side letter arrived via Pauline's office at 11 that morning. It was 4 pages. Brendan had signed it on behalf of Ashby Capital, under a limited authority clause that had been buried in a 2021 board resolution, the kind of thing that got passed in a 40-minute meeting and forgotten about. And it committed Ashby Capital to an indemnification structure that effectively made the firm liable for any regulatory action against the Duvet joint entity for a period of 5 years post-merger. Pauline called him as soon as she'd read it. "He could have done a lot of damage with this," she said. "Yes. Do you want to know who the Duvet meeting was with?" "The real principals?" He did, she told him. Philippe Audet he already knew about. The third name, not Corinna Staub, who turned out to be a legitimate but unwitting participant, was a man named Russell Vane, who had been the subject of an OSE investigation 3 years prior involving fund misrepresentation. The investigation had been closed without charges. It had also been the reason a colleague of Theodore's, a man named Grant Oduya, had lost his firm. He sat with that for a while. He had known Brendan was ambitious. He had known, in the way you know things you don't want to examine too closely, that Brendan's relationship with Simone had a transactional quality to it. That Brendan had been drawn to Theodore's daughter partly because of who her father was. He had told himself it didn't matter, that people married for complicated reasons, that what mattered was whether they were good to each other. He had perhaps not looked closely enough at whether that was true. At 2 in the afternoon, he asked Simone to meet him in his study. She came with her coffee cup and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd sat in since a teenager when they'd had the serious conversations. University choices, her mother's illness, the time she'd wanted to leave law school and he'd asked her to give it one more semester. He told her everything. He didn't soften it. That was the thing he'd learned, belatedly, about the distance between them. He had spent too many years softening things for Simone because she was his daughter and he had wanted to protect her, and she had spent too many years feeling managed rather than trusted. So he told her about the duvet filing, Brendan's name on it. The side letter, the indemnification clause, Russell Vane, the phone call Maisie had heard in the garden. She didn't speak while he was talking. She held her coffee cup in both hands and she looked at a fixed point somewhere past his left shoulder and she listened. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since last night." "And you didn't." She stopped, started again. "Why didn't you tell me last night?" "Because I didn't have enough to show you yet. I wanted to make sure what I was telling you was true." She looked at him then. Her eyes were bright, and he could see her working through it. The anger, the disbelief, the slower and more painful process of fitting this new information into everything she thought she knew about her life. He recognized that process. He had done a version of it himself, sitting at his desk in the early hours of the morning with the rain against the windows. 7 years, she said. Yes. She set her coffee cup down on the edge of his desk and pressed both hands flat on her thighs. How bad is it? Legally. Pauline says the side letter is binding but potentially challengeable given the scope of the board resolution. The indemnification clause can be unwound if we move quickly. The restructuring agreement itself is void. Brendan doesn't have authority to have signed the Duvet directorship without disclosure to the board. And Brendan? That depends on what he knew about Vane and what he was expecting to get out of this. She was quiet again. Then she said, Maisie told you. She came to my study after 11 o'clock last night in her pajamas. She'd heard him on the phone in the garden. Simone's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, the kind you'd miss if you didn't know her face. She didn't tell me. She told me, he said. And then, because it needed to be said, she was trying to protect you. Simone looked out the window. The rain had moved off. The garden was wet and still. The hedge flattened from the night before, and somewhere out there Maisie was at school, wearing her fox print socks, probably with no idea that what she had said in a doorway at 11:43 the previous night had shifted the weight of several people's lives. What do I do? Simone said. It was not a question she had asked him in a long time. He felt the weight of it carefully. That's yours to decide, he said. The firm? I can manage. I need you to think about what you want. Not what you think you should do, not what's easiest, what you actually want. She nodded. She didn't say anything else. She picked up her coffee cup and stood up and went to the window seat, and she stood there for a while with her back to him. And he let her. Pauline filed the formal disclosure challenge that afternoon. By the following morning, Duvet Partners had received notice of the void restructuring agreement and the pending board review of Brendan's authority. By the end of the week, the OSC had been notified of Russell Vane's renewed involvement in an Ontario-registered financial transaction. Brendan had not been back to the house. Theodore did not call him. There was nothing he wanted to say to Brendan Colville that his lawyers could not say more effectively. What he did instead, on Thursday evening, was pick Maisie up from school himself. This was usually Simone's job, but Simone had agreed to it without him having to explain. He pulled up in front of the school in the old Volvo. Maisie had always liked the Volvo, said it smelled like Christmas, and she came through the doors with her backpack half falling off one shoulder and her hair coming loose from its braid, and she spotted him and smiled. She got in and buckled up and said, How come you're here? I wanted to be, he said. She accepted this. They drove for a while. The city moved past the windows, the brick schools and the damp October trees and the coffee shops with their windows fogged from the inside. Grandpa, she said, what I told you. He thought about what to say. He thought about the side letter and the indemnification clause and Pauline's voice on the phone at 7:15 in the morning. He thought about Simone standing at his study window with her back to him and her coffee gone cold. Yes, he said. It helped a great deal. She nodded, satisfied the way children are when they've done the right thing and been told so plainly. Good, she said. And then she looked out the window and they drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable silence that felt, to Theodore Ashby, like something slowly being repaired.